In this video, we're going to talk about the basics of human population growth, and we'll start by looking at the history of human population so that we can understand when the human population started to grow and how much things have changed over the last couple hundred years. We're going to look at what regions have grown the most historically and look at patterns in population growth across continents and countries today. As we move forward, this will provide a good foundation for understanding the future of human population growth. Lastly, we're going to talk about the difference between absolute and relative growth rates. Understanding how these are different is really important to being able to predict how populations will change in the future. When did population really start growing? You can see the answer in this slide. For most of human history, there have not been very many people on the planet. In fact, if you go back 600 years to the early 1400s, there were only about 400 million people on Earth. We didn't hit our first billion until somewhere around 1880. We hit 2 billion around 1925, 3 billion in 1960, 4 billion in 1975, 5 billion in 1988, 6 billion around 1997, 7 billion in 2011, and we'll hit 8 billion sometime in 2021. You can see the shape of this curve is a classic example of exponential growth. But there's a lot hidden under this curve that we need to talk about to understand the future of population growth. Let's dig in a little deeper and look at how different countries have changed over the last couple hundred years. One of my favorite sites to use for looking at population data is gapminder.org, and the animations I'll show you here and in an upcoming slide are from that site. You can go to the site and explore a wide range of additional information around population, demographics, and many other topics. So let me orient you to this graph before we start. On this graph, we see time on the x-axis, total population on the y, and each of the circles represents a country. The size of the circle is proportional to its population, and the color of the circle tells you what part of the world it represents. Red for Asia, blue for Africa, yellow for Europe and Russia, and green for the Americas. Those two big red circles you see are China on the top and India just below. The entire rest of the world is in those little dots at the bottom. As we watch this animation go forward, we see a lot of things change. First, China was a big country to start, and it gets bigger as time goes on. India is also large, and the two together dominate world population up to about 1900. Then things start to change a little bit. That green dot that starts to emerge in the 1920s is the United States, and you can see it will continue to go up. By the end of the curve, you can see that China's growth takes off in the 70s and 80s, and that brings us up to where we are now. The next image shows us what world population looks like in 2018. Each little square on the map represents 500,000 people, and the size of the country gives you a sense of the total population. China and India are the largest countries in the world. One interesting thing to note on this map is how many of the world's most important economic powers really do not have large populations. Look at the European countries for an example of that. Now, notice that many of the poorer countries on the planet, particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa, Indonesia, and parts of Asia, also have very large populations. Now let's take a look at how 4 example countries have changed over time. The US and Japan are wealthy industrialized countries. China was a poor country through much of the 20th century, but that has changed recently, and Nigeria remains a low-income country today. Let's look at each one of these countries separately as the image progresses. China's population started to rise quickly around 1950, but as you can see, the curve bends downward around the mid-1990s, illustrating that population growth rates are starting to slow. The United States, in contrast, has a steady upward trend through most of the period. There are 2 reasons for this in the US that we'll talk about later, but include modestly high birth rates and immigration. If we look at Japan, we see steady growth up until about 1970, and then we actually see a decline in population up to the present. Japan is an example of a country that is actually starting to shrink in population, and we'll explore this phenomenon in a later video, but it presents many challenges to society. Lastly, Nigeria. The population growth in Nigeria looks like it's just ramping up, and it has a shape that looks much like an exponential curve. Countries like Nigeria will end up being very important to population growth in the future, as we'll talk about in one of the next videos. Now we need to talk about growth rates, and specifically the difference between absolute and relative growth rates. We'll do this quickly here, but there's a calculation example in Excel that will let you build your own model for estimating population growth. All right, so first, absolute growth rates are just total growth per unit time, usually measured in the number of people added to the population in a day, a month, or a year. A relative growth rate is growth relative to population size. This might be 1 person for every 100, and it's often represented as a percentage per unit time. 1 person per 100 per day, or year, or month. The difference between these rates matters a lot, and it's important to know which one you're talking about. An absolute growth rate is just added on each year if we have a 2% absolute growth rate in a population of 1 million. Then we just simply add 20,000 people to the population each year, and after 100 years we have almost 3 million people. A relative growth rate means that we add 2% of the total population each year. And in year 1, that's 20,000 people. But in year 2, that's 20,400 people. And by year 100, we reach over 7 million people. This is an example of what's called exponential growth. If we now take a look at absolute growth rates around the world, then what we see is that Asia has the largest absolute growth rate, but that it has declined over the past 20 years. Now keep in mind that Asia is also the most populated part of the world, and so it makes sense that a bigger population will have a larger absolute growth rate, even if the relative growth rate is low, as we'll see on the next slide. Africa's absolute growth rate has been steadily increasing, and it looks like it might exceed that of Asia in the next decade or two. The rest of the world is down there at the bottom, and for obvious reasons is far less important for the future of the global population. If we now look at the rate of natural population increase, or the relative growth rate, we see really interesting patterns. And in fact, most regions are declining, and some are declining very quickly. Look at Europe. In the years around 2000, the rate of natural population increase in Europe was actually negative, and now is just close to zero. As I mentioned on the last slide, Asia has the largest absolute population growth rate, but its relative growth rate is really not that much higher than North America and is about the same as Latin America and the Caribbean. Where are growth rates the highest? The answer is Africa. But what might come as a surprise is that even in Africa, it looks like relative growth rates are starting to decline. This will also be very important in the future. Let's put all of this together and summarize what we know. The world experienced rapid population growth in the 20th century. Most of that historical growth was in Asia, but now absolute growth rates in Asia are slowing, while those in Africa are increasing. Relative growth rates all over the world are either stable or falling. So things are changing, but we do know that growth will continue in the total human population for the next few decades. As we'll talk about in one of the next videos, the period of time from 1950 to 2100, however, remains very uncertain. But we'll leave that for one of the next videos.